Hey there and welcome back to another Miraculous Ladybug video. And today, I want to talk a little bit about the character of Gabriel Agreste and really take a deeper look at his character and consider the question, is he a well-written villain? Now, I've spoken in depth about a lot of the various different characters within the show. I've talked in depth about whether Ladybug and Noir are Mary Sue's, or whether they're problematic protagonists, or whether they're one-note and lack depth, if their arcs are well-written. I've picked apart every aspect of their characters, and I've even looked at some of the more minor characters too, most notably, Chloe, talking about her character arcs and whether she's an example of wasted narrative potential. Which, she kind of is, let's be real. But anyway, whilst I've talked about Gabe in depth before, I don't think I've really ever taken a look at his character arc under this sort of microscope and talked about whether he was actually well written as a character. And so, obviously, that's what today's video is all about. Talking through whether Gabe's character and narrative arc are well developed and engaging. Both in a more generalized way, as in is he fun to watch and does his story draw you in, but then more importantly, as the main antagonist of the series. Does he work well as the final big boss? Can he compete with other iconic animated villains? Does his story have that feeling of importance, that sense of gravitas? Does he feel like a crucial part of the story being told, or could you swap him out for any old bad guy and the effect would stay the same? That's really what I hope to puzzle out today. So with all that being said, let's jump into it. And I guess we'll start off with Season 1. And in Season 1, there are really two facets of the character that need to be dealt with. First, his identity of Gabriel Agreste, and then his alter ego of Hawkmoth, because for a decent chunk of that first season, despite them having the same voice actor and doing pretty much the same voice in every dub I've watched, there's still an attempt to throw you off the scent, and therefore have the reveal that Hawkmoth is Adrien's dad be all exciting. Now, I think for me, it was always deeply obvious as soon as I heard the voices, but for some reason, it did work for some people. I remember at the time, there were some decently popular posts talking about how they're not the same character. How you can't just assume, and it's like, come on mate. But anyway, that's not what we're here for. We're here to talk about well-written characters. And I think I would argue that in Season 1, neither Gabe nor Hawkmoth were really written all that well. And I'm currently doing a rewatch of Season 1, and my god, some of these episodes are quite hard to watch. Like, I get on one hand we need to kind of cut the writing team some slack here, as first seasons can often be a bit weird in terms of character development and all that, but on the other hand, so many other shows have really clear and interesting arcs for their characters, even over the course of that first season, that alter how they behave between episode 1 and their finale. But Season 1 of Miraculous just doesn't do that. And with the heroes, I think it does slip a bit under the radar, as you get to see them more often and thus you explore their personality a bit more. So therefore, you don't really notice that they hardly develop at all from episode 1 to episode, 22? And thus, you can really just watch the episodes in almost any order you want. But with Gabe and Hawkie, it gets more obvious, especially since you have to split their screen time into two different characters, as there isn't that confirmation that they were the same character just yet. And as a result, both sides of the character came out of it looking really two-dimensional. Like for starters, Gabe throughout Season 1 is just presented as a neglectful and abusive father, confining his son to his house, forcing him to work as a model even if he doesn't want to, controlling who he talks to and who he interacts with, forgetting his birthday, missing meals, not spending time with him at all, and just being a massive asshole in general. Like seriously, there's basically nothing redeeming about this guy in Season 1. Nothing at all. And so he very much comes across as a two-dimensional mean dad trope. And that's all he is. He doesn't have any depth, and he certainly doesn't have any development. And it's even worse for the Hawkmoth side of things. The supposed main villain, who basically just stands around in every episode, says some angry villain words and then evil laughs, gets beaten and then swears revenge every single time. And that's it for the most part. And at the time, when it released, I think people were able to look past this, because the concept itself, the story, the heroes, it was cool. It was interesting. It was new. But in hindsight, you go a full 20 plus episodes of Season 1, and this guy does nothing. He does jack shit. Like, we learn a tiny bit about him in the last episodes and the origin story, but that's it. And so I would have to argue that in Season 1, he's really more of a plot device than he is a character. Which, for your main antagonist, really isn't that great. And basically, his development doesn't start at all until Season 2, which is not a good look. Especially when they've had so many episodes to infuse a bit of narrative development. And really, that's just a big trend in the writing anyway. The development in Miraculous Ladybug is just so slow, or absent altogether. But it's especially evident with Gabe in season 1, to the point that he hardly matters in the grand scheme of things. The third most important character in the show feels like they hardly matter to the story at all, other than to create a bit of angst or create and empower the actual villains. Imagine that. Ugh. Yeah, season 1 Gabe/Hawkmoth just ain't it. He's not well constructed, and he's not well written. He's very dull. But then, in season 2, I would argue there were some signs of improvement. Yes, there's still a lot of Gabe being a pretty two-dimensional villain with no real nuance or depth, and a lot of generic angry dad Gabe like, "Grrr, you didn't play the piano perfectly. You aren't allowed to spend any time with your friends. Go practice." And then a lot of generic cartoon villain Hawkmoth, "Grrr, get me the Miraculous." But on the other hand, we do start to unravel some more of the story during the second season. Reasons behind why he does what he does. Explanations as to why he treats his son poorly, and why he's so disagreeable to basically every person that he meets. Reasons for us, as the audience, to care about his character, and his motivations behind his life as a villain. We learn that his wife is gone, and it's his dream to get the Miraculouses to make a wish that will restore her to life. And since this is well before we know that this would in fact destroy the world, suddenly, he could be viewed through a much more sympathetic lens. We start to understand how he became this, and whilst it doesn't absolve him, it does explain things, and it gives him added depth. That in his pursuit of trying to reunite his family by reviving his wife, the actual family that he still has left, i.e. Adrien, is slipping further and further away from him. Plus, we actually got to see some scenes that actually showed that, he does care about his son, even just a little bit. He's shown to care a little bit about his son's safety in regards to akumatized villains, like when Godzilla drops him off a building and when Riposte wants to duel him. And he even sits down to watch Solitude, the film that Emily starred in, with his son at the end of Godzilla. Plus, we see that he's forming a closer friendship with his assistant Natalie, and that she's being trusted with more and more responsibility in his evil schemes. Hal even panics hard when she uses the Peacock Miraculous, because he's worried about the long-term effects it's going to have on her health. So he actually makes a friend. He actually gets a little bit of positive growth, positive depth, and this kind of thing prevents him from seeming like an out-and-out monster. It gives him a third dimension, and we can start to see underneath the trauma, underneath the grief, and underneath the anger. We see that despite all these negative things, he does actually care about the people around him, but the loss of his wife and the desire to bring her back to life has been quite all-consuming. And thus, he damages his relationships with those around him and just becomes an all-around turd. But we see that when he's able to let go of his obsession, like when he gives up briefly, he quickly reverts to a more rational and reasonable person and reconciles quickly with his son. And hell, he even leaves the house. And so I'd argue that season 2 really did go a long way to improve the quality of the writing for Gabe's character. And it really helped flesh out his role as the main antagonist of the series, whilst also giving him some redeemable qualities, as well as adding that depth to his characterization. But I still think that after season 2, they had a ways to go to really get him to the level that he needed to be at, whilst also still progressing the story. Because despite all this positive stuff that I just mentioned, I think season 2 is also where the rot really starts to seep in, where his storyline starts to stagnate hard, even as his character development improves. And this is simply because of the length of the show. There's so many episodes. And so for most of seasons 2 and 3, he hardly manages to accomplish anything as a villain. His arc very much freezes in place, and he does not much. And so you have to wait until season 4 to get some actual story progression, as opposed to character development. I mean, the only major progression that he gets in these seasons comes in the form of hunting down Fu over the course of season 3, and then failing to actually do anything of note other than to allow Ladybug to become even stronger by being the Guardian. Oopsie! But even that, it's really more Marinette's story arc than Gabriel's. But at least we do get a little bit more of that human side to him, and he starts to grow closer to Natalie, who seemingly falls in love with him, at least that's always the vibe I got. And a number of times, he actually full-on prioritizes her and her well-being over actually following through on some of his grand plans. And all the while, you start to see these doubts creep in about how he's pushing his son away, and that despite all this being for him, he might still lose him in the end anyway, and his family will still be incomplete. So, season 3, it's a little bit better in terms of his writing, because whilst his actual role as the villain of the story really did start to stagnate, his relationships grew more and more complex. And by the end of the season, he was one of the most interesting characters to watch, simply because he had so much depth. He had a massive potential to be the worst sort of douchebag, but then the ability to be very kind and nurturing at the same time. Plus, they actually gave him a bit of a brain in actually making an alliance. But, as usual, it fell short as Gabe retains his all-too-famous smooth brain persona. And so, that brought us to Season 4. And I think this is the season that actually lost a lot of people, and it cost the show a number of fans. But honestly, I have to say that the writing for this season was actually pretty decent, at least in my opinion. And this is especially notable when it comes to Gabe, because as a villain, he was actually very compelling. His evil plots, at last, most of them made sense, and they grew more and more complex. And thus, he would be involved in the episodes for a longer period of time. We got to see a lot more of Gabe and Adrien bonding scenes, where it's made clear that he's trying to be a better father, but is still struggling under the weight of being Shadow Moth and trying to revive Emily by getting the Miraculouses. We continue his side plot with Natalie as he cares for her while she's sick and takes on her responsibilities to try and lighten her load, to try and help her. And then on the other hand, we see his interactions with Felix and their own little game of one-upmanship that they play to try and compete with one another. And then on top of that, there's the mystery of the family rings. And honestly, when you put all of that together, in terms of Gabe's screen time, development, and character arc, this season, Season 4, really did hit a new high for him. He felt important at last. But beyond that, he also felt complex and conflicted, and he even came across as a genuine threat to the heroes, for once. And from what we've seen during Season 5, I think this is a trend that's going to continue. And so, to answer my overall question that really did prompt this video, I really do have to conclude that by this stage, Gabe is actually quite a well-written villain. He's very well defined. A conflicted family man who's become obsessed with getting his hands on the Miraculouses to bring back his wife, but now who has also become obsessed with getting revenge on the heroes who he feels are out to get him and consistently thwart all his plans. And whilst he continues this downward spiral, he continues to push everybody away, including his son. And as of Season 5, Natalie as well. And all of this because of his obsession and inability to let things go. And yet under the surface of this, we still get flashes of the person that he clearly used to be before all this went down. And so against the odds, considering how bland he was during Season 1, every season has managed to up his character development and his arc to the next level. And so whilst many aspects of the writing can be questioned and you can argue it's going downhill, I don't think Gabe is. He's just going up. After all, the writers have taken a character who'd become very stale very quickly, and over the course of Seasons 2, 3, and 4, they've given him a new lease on life with a lot of narrative complexity, at least for the standards of the show. After all, Miraculous is not Shakespeare. And in general, I still think they could do better in terms of their narrative and character development for all characters. But anyway, with that being said, these are just my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think about Gabe's character? Is he well written? Maybe not. Are you somewhere in between perhaps? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.